Part 1. The 10-Step Program. The cultured thug is the heir to the greatest thinkers of all time. Part of the problem the cultured thug faces is that the culture today is hostile to these greatest thinkers, partly because they're dead white men, but also because these greatest thinkers challenge most of the traditional wisdom of the past few centuries, which is radically opposed to everything that came before. What we call our liberal tradition is not only cringy and stupid, as we shall see throughout this book, but more importantly, it is just as revolutionary as Bolshevik communism. We live in a culture where your two options are woke nonsense on the one hand, and yesterday's woke nonsense on the other hand. There are no genuine alternatives on offer. This book offers a genuine alternative. Today, this alternative is called the radical right, but in reality it is anything but radical. What you're about to discover is that these pages is rather the null hypothesis, the default position of all history up until the day before yesterday. It is what all healthy societies have always lived and breathed, and it has created everything we now take for granted. It only looks radical because liberalism is the most extreme ideology that has ever existed in the history of the world. When you live at the North Pole, everything looks like the Deep South. This genuine alternative that we're presenting should not be thought of as the radical right, but as the deep center. Nevertheless, we shall use the term radical right throughout this book to avoid confusion with milquetoast centrism, which is only slightly less radical than wokeness. But before we can take up this genuine alternative, we need to wean ourselves of the fake conservatism that poses as the wisdom of the ages. There's no one red pill that will get us there in one shot, so we offer 10 of them as first steps down the path to recovery. 1. The state of exception. Suppose for a moment that there is one ultimate red pill, one piece of information that would explain our real problems so clearly that they'd already be half solved. If you could give this red pill only to one person, who would it be? For most of us until 2020, that was probably Trump. He was the man who, at least at first, both seemed to know what had to be done and was in charge. But was he really in charge? Clearly not. Or you'd have a wall, millions of deportations, and an actual country. Was George W. Bush in charge? Was Joe Biden in charge? Put it this way. If Joe Biden had wanted to nuke Britain or Israel, would he have been allowed to? If you're a foreign diplomat sitting down with a Joe Biden, you know you're not talking to the man who calls the shots. He's just there to smile and pretend he doesn't have Alzheimer's. If you want to talk to someone in charge, you'd be better off talking to the board of directors at Goldman Sachs, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the Secretary of State. Now, if you sit down with Vladimir Putin, that's a different story. You know you're talking to the man who calls the shots. That's because Russia is a real country, with a real chain of command and real leadership. Contrary to what the New York Times says, this is what a transparent society looks like. America is not transparent. Even by the standards of history, it's highly opaque. More opaque than Imperial China, more opaque than Pharaonic Egypt, because at least China had an emperor and Egypt had a pharaoh. This man in charge has a name, and that name sounds a bit quaint these days, mostly because we don't like anyone being in charge anymore. That man in charge is called the sovereign. We don't like anyone being in charge, but someone always is in charge. There is always a sovereign, and ultimately it's always one man. What makes Vladimir Putin the sovereign and Joe Biden not? What makes Putin the sovereign is that the buck stops with him. When he decides that something is going to be this way and not that, nobody in Russia stands above him, and nobody can check him, not even the law. A better way of putting this is that Putin decides when there will be an exception to the rule. If the law, or the Supreme Court, or the Federal Assembly says one thing and Putin says another, no question about it. Putin wins. They lose. This is what having a real country looks like. Having a clear sovereign. Putin decides when the normal rules do and don't apply, so in effect he is the rules. We call this deciding the state of exception. When you want to find out who calls the shots, don't ask who makes the rules. Anyone can make a rule. Ask yourself who is allowed to break the rules. Especially ask yourself who decides when the rules can be broken. This is the sort of master rule that stands above all the other rules. If you find out who decides this, the state of exception, then you've put your finger on who calls the shots. You've found the sovereign. Did Trump call the shots? As president, he was commander-in-chief, which means he was the head of the military, and under the Insurrection Act, he could have deployed it to start deporting people. When the head of the military gets thwarted at every turn and deplatformed by Twitter, he is not calling the shots. Trump didn't make the rules, and he sure as hell wasn't deciding when they could be broken. Someone else was deciding that for him, the sovereign. Now, in the United States, formally, the people are sovereign, but the people elect Congress. The people elect the president. And through the president, the people elect the Supreme Court. The people determine all three branches of government. Are the people getting what they want? The people are not sovereign. Someone else is. This situation is so old, it has a Latin name. Imperium in imperio. A state within a state. That state within the state calls the shots because it decides when the rules do and don't apply. It wields the state of exception. Let's take a closer look at this state within a state. Summary. The buck always stops somewhere, the sovereign. The sovereign is he who decides when the rules can be broken. The people are not sovereign. 2. The deep state. All societies have had a state within a state at some point. It starts out as something quite harmless, but eventually grows out of control and starts to reproduce for its own sake at the expense of the whole, like a societal cancer cell. This seems to be a sort of historical law. We're not special, we have one too. First, let's say what the deep state is not. The deep state is not a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are what people who reject the great man view of history call everything they don't like. The charge of conspiracy theory is just the attempt to banish human agency from the world by people that have little agency themselves. These people will then turn around and approvingly quote feminist Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And not for a second think about the implications of this statement for their worldview. We might do better to think of the deep state as the permanent government. Put it this way, it's clear that the deep state is just the civil service, or some part of it. That part of the civil apparatus, that part of the state apparatus, that's unaccountable and can't be removed no matter how hard you vote. If you're still not comfortable with this, and the deep state still rings like a conspiracy in your ears, I want you to swap in permanent government for that term every time you hear it and see if it doesn't match up perfectly. Properly understood, the deep state is something that can't be doubted. We obviously have a civil service and a basic principle of democratic government that continues more or less unchanged no matter who gets elected. This supposedly is one of its virtues, that a tyrant can't replace it. No wonder so much energy has gone into ensuring that we understand it improperly. The deep state has a long history. There have been deep states in all society, and the closer a society is to dying, the more power its deep state has. For example, the Roman Senate held no official sovereignty and had no delegated powers, but was in effect a co-sovereign along with the consulship. The Roman Senate came to dominate the consulship by open violence and threats, and this was the spark that eventually caused the Roman Republic to go up in smoke. The deep state did the same in the Egyptian Old Kingdom too. In the 6th dynasty, the power of the priesthood and administrative service grew at the expense of the executive power. The end of this dynasty was marked by a senile ruler who looked more like an ornament than a pharaoh. Pepi II reigned for an astounding 94 years, and afterward Egypt collapsed into the chaos and warlordism of the first intermediate period. The view is that the deep state is a conspiracy or a new idea is held only by historically illiterate midwits who don't know any better, or by malicious actors who do know better. Dangerous either way. These people have no business in the public square. Let's look at an example of a modern deep state in action. One of the most obvious centers of unofficial power is in the intelligence community, since it controls the flow of information. Intelligence agencies such as the CIA and NSA work together with law enforcement, mainstream media, and other trusted sources to effectively shape public opinion and what counts as fact. A typical example goes something like this. The intelligence community releases a report that tells the mainstream media something it wants to hear, like white supremacist terrorism is the #1 national security threat, or Antifa is an idea, not an organization, or damaging allegations against a political enemy. The mainstream media will repeat it, lending weight and credibility to misleading, unverifiable, or outright false information. This will then be picked up by anonymous Wikipedia editors who will cite only these mainstream sources, which they call reliable. The media knows how this works, and it so selectively omits important details that could damage the narrative it and the Wikipedia subculture want to spin. These omitted details are reported only by people doing actual journalism, i.e. outside of the mainstream, but anything outside of the mainstream is considered original research by Wikipedia, no matter how factual and verifiable, and it is excluded. Wikipedia is then taken as fact by most people. Intelligence agencies manage information flows in many other ways. Let's give another example. Traditional media was a choke point for shaping public opinion, but since the rise of social media, the deep state has had to work hard to regain control over what people think. Social media was just too open and inclusive. Intelligence agencies can't openly censor, say, Twitter, but what they can do is to decide what counts as hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories, foreign campaigns, etc., at least for the purposes of law enforcement. Because these things are vague, they need to be defined. Because they're illegal, who defines them defines what you can and can't see on the internet. Facebook is not going to take a stand and police hate speech only to the letter of the law because this is risky. The law could change any time because the law is defined by the one who wields it. Hence, in 2018, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence tried to pressure Facebook to make its hate speech policies go beyond the legal classifications, only to find that they already did. In these ways, intelligence agencies can damage anyone in a position to rein them in. This is typical of elements in the deep state who want to remain autonomous and unchecked. This is not just a bug in liberalism that can be fixed, but a feature called separation of powers. This separation is accomplished formally by splitting the government into 3 branches, but is much better accomplished informally by departments like the CIA and advisory bodies like the SPLC or the Roman Senate. The power of the deep state lies in obscuring what we call in the last chapter the sovereign. The goal is to create the illusion that no one is really in charge and that everyone acts as checks and balances on everyone else. In this worldview, there is no oversight or actual governance, only a vast bureaucracy that spontaneously marches in ideological lockstep, held together usually by a mystical force like progress or the arc of history, bending toward whatever is not in the best interests of normal people. People are much easier to rule when they believe they're not being ruled. There are countless examples of this. The Tao Te Ching advises as much. The highest type of ruler is one of those whose existence the people are barely aware. Next comes one whom they love and praise. Next comes one whom they fear. Next comes one whom they despise and defy. The Thebans called their own popular government oligarchia isonomos, meaning something like constitutional oligarchy. This term is probably the closest we have to honestly describe America today. You are supposed to believe that your vote matters, whereas the real decisions that will shape your children's and grandchildren's future are being made without your being consulted. The deep state prefers not to consult you because it's afraid you'll elect someone who will put it in its place. But it's not only the deep state that runs the show. The true sovereign bleeds into the private sphere. In the next chapter, we'll look at who else decides the exception on your behalf. Summary. The deep state is the permanent government. Every society has a deep state, and the deep state's power lies in concealing who is in charge.